Hi everyone, Chris from Prime Palette here to show a new in progress painting that I've been working on. This is a illustration for a competition that I'm entering to kick off this year, and I wanted to show you some of the process that went into building this illustration. So here's my workspace. I've got my color over on my left-hand side. This is a little bit of a new workspace here. And then I also have over on the right-hand side all of my brushes. In the top right, you can see these are my most top 5 used brushes, and they're labeled as Prime Palette brushes. However, they're actually just Photoshop stock brushes that might have been tweaked ever so slightly to be only opacity or only size. And then based off of those variations, I have texture versions of those too, where there's a little bit of a simulation of what would be natural media to give it a real feel. So that's the overall setup that we have going right now. And I do not move this around much at all during the course of working on this. Canvas in the center, color off to the left, brushes and layers off to the right. Let's dive in and see how this progresses. All right, so right off the bat, I'm laying in a lot of variation in value. Value being the difference between light and dark, that spectrum of light and dark. And I'm being pretty free to encourage myself to focus on the composition of the illustration versus specific detail. I'm not using reference material for this specific illustration. I do want to get into using reference material more. I need it for my own art skills as an illustrator, but for this specific illustration, we are just drawing from the mind, which is fun. Adding a little more variation to the value, starting to create some sculptural forms. I'm using a nice round brush for all of this. Nothing tricky, nothing out of the ordinary. Continuing to build up that variation in value. Starting to create a little bit of layers going on here as well too. Speaking of layers, on the top right hand corner, you'll notice right now that top right hand corner right up here, I only have one layer active right now beyond the transparent base layer. Everything else is completely in one layer at this point. Looks like a little bit of a pause. There we go. Keeping everything really neutral. It's good practice to start with a neutral background and add in the more saturated colors later. So what I'm talking about when I'm talking about saturated color, this on this side of the color triangle is a saturated color, so it's that pure color. Anything mixed with the gray, that's a neutral color. And again, some variation between cool and warm color. So some blue. You'll notice there's a little bit of yellow right over in this area. That's purely to make it visually interesting. Not much else is going on in terms of that. I might be indicating that that yellow light is reflective of another thing inside of the illustration that we don't see in this composition. That's a possible interpretation. Adding up more of those values, the variation. I'm not drawing a lot of hard lines yet, just blocking in a lot of the specifics related to value. Let's skip ahead a bit to right about here. So after I've established enough depth from that variation in value, now I'm going to start going in with this Prime Palette, no opacity, only size brush. So I've actually upgraded my digital art tablet, not by a ton. I'm not using a display tablet. This is the Wacom Intuos Pro the medium size. I prefer it because it fits on my desk nicely. I can actually slide it back behind my keyboard when it's not in use. Honestly, between this pad and the last pad, not a ton of difference. This pad feels a little bit heavier. The pen feels nicer in my hand. If you're using one of the $80 or $100 Intuos pads, totally fine. You're going to have just as much capacity to illustrate on the computer as if you're spending that $200 or $300 on the nicer pad. I don't recommend the display tablets because there's a lot that goes into dedicating your workspace for that. If I didn't have a MIDI keyboard over here, if I wasn't doing music production and art, I would say, yeah, maybe that display tablet would be nice to have over here on the right, or maybe it'd be nice to have over on the left. However, a standard Wacom Intuos is going to be plenty good to start your illustration to get into doing digital artwork. And remember, a lot of the concepts that we're sharing here on these videos apply to traditional media as well. It's easy for me to demonstrate and speak to the things that are happening on this illustration using digital artwork versus doing traditional media. Hopefully in the future, I'll be able to set up some cameras around doing oil painting. For now, we have this. All right, so the process that I'm using right here to complete the outlines and edges is very intuitive. I'm sure there's a specific name for what I'm doing right now. Mostly, I am going in and designating what are the specific individual forms that exist within this illustration based on the free form that I did in the first, I would say 2, maybe hour and a half hours of work going into this illustration. So doing these brush strokes, these line work pieces, helps the eye distinguish edge, which also reiterates the form and the capacity to see depth, three-dimensionality, something that feels real. Going in to the rest of these forms, adding more value, lighter values after I've already designated where the edges are going to be. Adding in some more light blue colors here. So in these abstract pieces, there's a lot of meditation going in to the production of the actual piece. So it's therapy for me in a lot of ways, versus working from reference material is a lot more challenging for me at this point. I've worked with enough reference material that I can do these abstract pieces and add a lot of flavor and value that came from doing artwork with reference material. But you can never stop leveling up when it comes to learning a skill, right? And the same is true with artwork. So if you want to grow your skill in abstract art, you should do reference material. And if you want to grow your skill in reference material, you should do abstract. The two do help build the capacity to do either one of the forms. And it's not like you can just do a ton of reference material and then move to abstract. You have to do it periodically. You have to do a little bit of abstract, do a little bit of more, and when I'm talking about reference material, I'm talking about sort of photorealistic artwork, and it doesn't have to be super photorealistic, but it certainly could be. Both of those practices support and help add a lot of value, add a lot of, using the word value, we're talking about the spectrum of light and dark, but they add a lot of capacity for you to illustrate in either one of those two different techniques or methods. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on in the painting here. So I'm creating much harder edges on these forms that are closest to the viewer. So generally, if you are looking at a piece of artwork, whatever is near the bottom format, the bottom of the format of the artwork is what's closest to you. Everything that's in the midground and at the top generally is farther from you. So in this piece, this holds true. And I want all of the elements that are closest to me to have those nice, sharp, crisp edges, have a little more texture, and to be unique to the rest of the artwork. So I've used a yellow and sort of a neutral dark purple to establish the elements that are closest to me in that bottom portion of the artwork all through here. I should point out, I'm doing a lot of testing. I'm doing a lot of experimentation in this artwork, and that is a lot less meditative and a lot more focused to identify what is something that's going to work well with this specific piece. So take a look and see all the different variations I'm going through right here to see if I like it, to see if it works. Adding in some lights, no, that didn't work. Photoshop allows you to do this much better than traditional media. I can throw all of this on a layer that exists over the top of everything, and then I can play around with that layer, and if I don't like it, if it doesn't work out, I can delete that layer, I can erase into that layer, and it's not going to affect any of the artwork that I've established on the lower layers. That's what Photoshop is all about, is these layers that allow you to work that way. You can do something like that with acrylic, right? Acrylic paint is nearly permanent after it dries, so you can lay down another layer of acrylic paint over the top of a dried acrylic piece, and from there, if you don't like it, if you hit it before it dries, which it's pretty lenient, you have about 30 to 40 minutes before it dries, you can wipe it away with water. Oil paint, the same thing. If you don't like the way a layer's working, and if you've got a dried layer of oil, you can wipe that away with more oil. It's a little more effective and not effective, but effective to a piece of oil paint to do it that way. But it can work. You can do that. Photoshop is king, or any digital media for that matter that uses layer when it comes to experimentation and trying things out. And for that reason, a lot of the times that I'm working on a piece of artwork, I'll take a photo of that artwork and then I will upload it to my computer, plug it into Photoshop, play around with it in Photoshop to see what colors work well, what sort of compositional adds or subtracts work well, and then I'll head back to the oil painting. Moving on to a new technique that we're going to use in this illustration is the process of starting with one single color in a fairly large block and then painting in other colors with a reduced opacity, aka kind of a watered down look. The way that we do this is just by shifting the opacity slider in the top left area of that brush control into something that's closer to 40%, 30%, 50%, and then just choosing whatever colors we feel like and painting in to that actual piece of color. So from doing this, we've coordinated each of those individual colors into one schematic, into one idea of color. This now allows me to add variation into the illustration that is still going to feel cohesive instead of a bunch of random colors. So it's a good technique, it's a good tip if you're looking to add a lot of extra color to your artwork but aren't feeling confident with your current selection of colors. So let's see how this turns out in the illustration. This is experimentation, and there's going to be a lot of experimentation that happens at this point in the painting, where if we hadn't slowed down the video as much as we are right now, we'd probably be about 3, maybe 4 hours into this digital painting, and I would consider this a speed painting based on how fast I traditionally move in digital media. Through these experimentations, we're identifying what works and what doesn't work. And what we've discovered so far is that if we go into these kind of purple and light cyan colors, it seems to work pretty well. Got the dog thinking that there might be a FedEx truck, but there's not, so she's off on her way. Okay, For the rest of this illustration, I am committing to that purple and cyan color. Cyan for the highlights, and this is a very high key cyan, aka high value, very light in color. And that purple is pretty much right here in the middle of this triangle. I'm not going too far into the neutral. I'm not going too far in the dark. This is an excellent way to establish a realistic looking shadow. As we look at shadows more in depth in real life, we'll notice that most shadows are not just gray. They usually have a lot of color in them. So if we're creating an illustration, why not boost that color? Why not add a little bit of extra zip to it? It has an appealing look. Make it happen. So let's zoom forward through the rest of this, establishing a lot of the different edges, the values. Here I am coming back in with a nice clean line to establish where those things are going to be, where those edges are, what I'm seeing, what I'm interpreting in the value changes. But it doesn't stop here. After we've established a lot of those lines, it's important after the fact to go in and make it feel cohesive. One of the favorite ways that I make that happen is by using the blender tool inside of Photoshop. So it is more than a smudge tool, which would normally just move pigment and color around. This actually applies a little bit of texture as well to the illustration as it blends those colors together. So as you watch and see, over the course of, it probably took me about an hour or so to get it to this stage right here. It has a kind of a less stark quality to it. It's a little more oil painty, a little more soft. It feels a lot more like traditional media. And I find that it has much more appeal. And if we're going for entertainment value and something that people want to look at for extended periods of time, I'm going to do everything I can to make that happen. Included under that same purview of making a piece of artwork entertaining, right? Something that people want to look at it and study a little bit deeper than just flipping through it. Adding a vignette to the edges can also help with this. So if you bring in a very soft brush with dark color and do the edges of your artwork a little bit darker than the center, it helps to frame the rest of the artwork itself. In addition to this, I'm also using Photoshop's auto tone, which would also provide me with the ability to go in and express certain colors more darker and certain colors that are lighter, bring them a little bit lighter. We've got that capacity in Photoshop. Yes, people might consider that cheating. However, I find that if your tool set allows you to do something when it comes to artwork, you've got access to it, use it. Why not use it? I'm doing a little bit more than just pushing a button when it comes to this. I am separating and copying out an additional layer that gets the full auto tone, and then I'm reducing the opacity of that layer over the top of the bottom layer. That way I've got a little more control as to how drastic and how impactful that auto tone effect is. At this point, the illustration's finished. I'm ready to send this off to the competition today. We'll see what happens. Hopefully we do have some updates in the future as to if it gets accepted, if it has anything that the jurors find interesting and they decide that they want to use it in the exposition they have. Great, fantastic. If not, the whole point of a competition is to hold yourself accountable to the very best you can do, right? And while if I wasn't working a full-time job, I could probably do a lot more with this illustration, I have to balance my life. And you do too. You've got a lot of things going on, so never feel like you have to reach for perfectionism. If you've spent 5, 6, 7, or 8 hours on a piece of artwork, you're learning something. And I look forward to learning more with you. Thank you for checking out this video. And we should have more music and more illustrations, more artwork as we go into 2021. Take care. Bye-bye.